So here we are. Um,
I'm going to mute myself so that you don't.
okay.
So that you don't have to listen to me mopping my nose.
Okay, that's fine. Okay. All right. So let's begin from here. Let's look at the. Let's look at Mishnah Bet again, and then we'll go through Mishnah Gimel. So in Mishnah Bet we said. So we're in the 6th chapter in Mishnah Bet. And Misha Zachab b'machta. צבע את הגחלים על גבי המזבח ורידדן בשולי המחתה והשתחווה ויצא. So the one who was zocha to get the machta, to get the coal pan. So we described how he took the coals off of the outer mizbeach. So he piles up the coals on the inner mizbeach, on the mizbeach hazahav, and then he flattens them down, spreads them around, using the bottom of the coal pan, and then he bows and he goes out. So Mishnah Gimel says Misha Zacha Bektoret. So the person who won the payis for the Ktoret, Hayonotel Tabazach Mitoch Hakaf. So again, just to remind us that he transported the Ktoret in a smaller kli called a bazach that had a cover on it, and he put that into a larger kli that was called a kaf. So now he takes the bazach from the kaf, he gives it to ohavo olikrovo, to his friend or to whoever is close to him. And nitpazer mimenu l'tocho, if some of the ktoret had spread out from it, from the bazach, into the kaf, no lo b'chafnav. The person who's now holding the kaf, he would gather that up with his fist and give it to the person with the ketoret, presumably putting it back into the bazach. So let's just look again at the Bartanur at this part. He says, so the one who won the right to do the ketoret, he would take the bazach from the kaf and he would give the kaf la'ohavo olikrovo. La'ohavo shabasha mimo lahechal l'tzorech kach. Who came there with him into the Hechal for this purpose, or for this need. And if some of the Ktoret fell out of the Bazach into the Kaf, this could happen because the Bazach was full and piled up. And what?
Heaping.
Yeah, that's a good word. In heaping, sometimes some of it would fall out from it into the kaf. So he says his friend who's there, he would notain ohavo et haktoret shenit bazer b'toch hakaf. So not the way I read it. That Notain al Havo, he gives his friend the Ktoret that had spread out, that had become scattered inside of the Kaf, the Chafnav Shel Maktir, with the the fistful of the person who's actually going to be doing the Ktoret. So exactly not the way I read it. Interesting. Let's take a look for a second at the, just a second. Let's look for a second at the Tiferet Yisrael on that part of the Mishnah. I was doing what I was preparing this week. I ended up going through a lot of other things to try to figure out a few particular details here, and it brought me all over. By the way, I'll just digress for a moment. I also got I'm still doing this research about the menorah, and you may I don't know if you noticed this, but there is a rather detailed Ramban. It's the second Ramban in Parshat Tetzaveh that we read not long ago, where he talks about the way the menorah is supposed to be done. He expands on that somewhat. I don't know which he wrote first, but he talks about it also in his Chidushim on Masechet Shabbat. And I'm trying to figure out the best way to pull all of these sources together. I think I may have mentioned in an earlier shir, there's a tshuva from the Rashba who came after the Ramban, where he talks about what the Ramban says, and he disagrees with the Ramban. He also disagrees with the Rambam, and he presents his whole way of understanding it. I may touch on it if we have time at the end, but let me just take a look for a moment here. You know what? Wait a second. Yeah, let's see. Yeah, here we are. So this is the, wait a second, make sure you see that. Okay. Sorry, this is the screen. So this is the Tiferet Yisrael on what we just read. It says the note no, and he gives it notain habazach. So the way he and this is the way the Rambam understands it. Right. So we just saw in the Mishnah that the person who just a second. What did we say? The person who is going to do the Ktoret, he takes the bazach from the kaf and he gives it. So the question is, what is the it that he gives? So the Bartanura says that he gave the kaf to his friend or the person close to him. And Tiferet Yisrael says he gave the bazach and he held on to the kaf. Notain habazach, he gave him the bazach. Udeloka Rabbeinu Bartanura, shekatav shnotain hakaf li'ovo. V'chein Rabbeinu Yavetz b'sidur shelo, the Yavetz Yaakov Emden ben Tzvi, who was much later. Yavetz was at the end of the 18th century. In his sidur, which I have, I didn't look it up for this shir, so I won't take time now. In his sidur, he also says he gives him the bazach ulechora mashma kedibrehen, and on apparently it's implied like their words. Mitkamar tzana chakach mitbazer mimenu letocho. When the Mishnah says that some of the Ktoret scattered from it, that perforce is talking about the bazach that was mentioned to begin. Shizkir tefillah, milat letocho kai akaf. The inside that it's going into is the inside of the kaf. Shizkir achara bazach that was mentioned after the bazach. No lo bechafnav, He gives it to him in his fists. Ratzah lomar, az merik ha'ochez hakaf. What it means is that the person who is holding on to the kaf, et hama'at hahu letoch chofnei hamaktir, that little bit, he's going to put it into the hands of the maktir, into the fists of the maktir. Nonetheless, it's impossible to say that. According to this, the bazach is still being held by the maktir. But according to what we're trying to say, his fists had to be open, they had to be available for this other person to fill them with the ktoret that's in the kaf. Who's going to pour the contents of the bazach into his fist? And would we think that all of the people who are now just doing Torah for the first time are so expert in this avodah, in this particular service of the Torah that's very difficult? The Gemara says that this that doing the Torah was avodah kasha b'mikdash. It was one of the more difficult avodot to do in the mikdash. That's the Gemara that he's referencing here. Because there, when it's talking about doing the Ktoret on Yom Kippur, obviously it's impossible for someone else to go with him into the Kodesh HaKodeshim. Right? We'll see later on in Yoma, when we get back to Yoma, that the Kohen Gadol goes into the Kodesh HaKodeshim holding the machta in his right hand and the bazach in his and the kaf in his left hand. He had to hold both of those things, right? Because no one can go in with him. Masha'en kein hacha, that which is not so here, hare ohavo b'tzido, because his friend is right next to him. Sheyuchal yiten lo habazach, he could hand him the bazach. ואין צריך תנא להזכיר שהניח הכף ברצפה ושקרובו מריק את הבזח לחופניו, שהרי לזה נתנו לו, אבל הזכיר תנא דאם נתפזר מהבזח הכף מריק גם זה לחופניו, צריך עיון. So he says that the Tana doesn't have to mention that he would have put here the kaf on the floor, which is what the Kohen Gadol has to do on Yom Kippur. But here he doesn't do that because the person next to him is there. It doesn't have to say this, that he would have put the kaf on the floor and that the person now who's next to him, who's holding the bazach, is going to pour the contents of the bazach into his fists. Shaharei lazeh nitanolo, because he gave it to him. In other words, he gave the kaf to the other person, according to the way the Bartunu understands. But the Tana mentions that if some of the Ktoret had become scattered from the bazach into the kaf, then he would pour this also into his fists. The tzarich, and this needs more deeper study. Anyway, so it's a bit confusing. So I kind of apologize because I didn't actually, as you may have guessed, prepare this Tiferet Yisrael. So let's just say for the moment that it's a bit confusing, but according to the way the Bartunu understands, let me get back to the other screen. Yeah, okay. according to the way the Bartenu understands, the person who's doing the Ktoret himself, he would take the bazach himself from the kaf, and then he would give the kaf to this person next to him. And according to the Bartenu, that means if some of the Ktoret had become scattered into the kaf, so the kaf is now being held by this other person. So notein ohavo et haktoret shenitpazer b'toch hakaf. So then the person who's holding the kaf, he's going to take the ktoret that had become scattered in the kaf, and he's going to put it into the fists of the maktir. In other words, he's not going to put it back into the bazach. He's going to put it directly in the hands of the kohen, who's going to act, who will now be putting the ktoret on the coals, right? Because he has to. That's how he's going to do it. In any event, well, we'll see a little bit more about how he's doing it. This is one of the things I was spending some time on to get some understanding about different opinions here. So so we read through this last time, but let's go through it a little bit more carefully now. And then they would teach him, right? The other Kohanim would teach this person who's going. Who are they teaching, and what are they teaching him?
They are teaching, I think, the assistant. No. Actually, but I'm not sure if that actually, I'm a little bit unclear as to whether they're teaching the assistant or whether they're actually teaching the person who's doing the Ketor, who is Zochei LeKetoret.
Okay, so let's just, since I've been jumping around, let's go back here. We're going to read it again. I think it should become clear. So Misha Zacha B'Ktoret, the person who has now been Zocha to do the Ktoret, he takes the bazach from the kaf. He gives it, we'll go with the way the Bartanur understands. He gives the kaf to his friend or the person who's next to him, standing next to him. Nitpazer mimenu l'tocho. If it turns out that some of the Ktoret had fallen into the kaf, no lo b'chofnav, then the person who now is holding the kaf puts it into the hands of the person who's going to do the Ktoret. U'melamdim oto, and they're going to teach him, Havi zahir shemetatchil lefanecha shelo tikaveh. Be careful lest you begin in front of you that you don't get burnt. So who are they teaching? And
They're actually teaching the person who's doing the Ketor. So
right.
actually, if I recall, now that I mentioned, if I recall correctly, they actually specifically, or the Memuneh specifically asked for somebody who was new at this.
Yes, right, of course, right. We always say we learned it before a few times, that this idea is that when they did the pais for the Ketoret, the Memuneh, what did he call out before he did the pais?
Anybody who hasn't done it.
Right, Chadashim Lektoret, Bo Vafisu. Whoever is new to doing the Ketoret, come and do the pais. So he now needs to be taught by people who know how to do this avodah, because he's never done it before. So one of the things they're teaching him very explicitly is, be careful, don't begin in front of you that you don't get burnt. And Michael, you gave an explanation to this last week. Do you remember what you said?
I actually liked yours more, however.
Well, that's okay. I mean, the only difference between yours and mine is that you emphasize the idea of the smoke coming up, which is also true. That's a little bit more complicated that we'll get into. But here, the Mishnah is saying, don't begin in front of you that you don't get burnt, So what does it mean, don't begin in front of you?
You start in the back, So you're not, you don't have to sort of, you
What?
don't have to, or you
Doing
start,
what? No, be explicit. What
oh,
you start doing? What? What are you doing?
putting the katoret on the coals.
Oh, so be careful lest you begin in front of you that you shouldn't get burnt. Right? So what are they telling him?
You don't want to be leaning over burning katoret.
Tell me exactly what they're trying to explain to him to do. What are they telling him to do when he puts the ketoret on?
They're telling him to start in the back and then to either side, so that he won't he won't have to lean over. If he starts in the front, then he's going to have to lean over the ketoret that's already put down. That's presumably smoking and burning, in order to reach the back. So they're
Right.
so they're telling him to start in the back first and work your way to the.
Work your way to the front. Very good. So be careful lest you begin in front. In other words, don't begin in front, shalot tikaveh, so that you won't get burnt. Because once you put the ketoret on the coals, it will start to burn. So of course the coals themselves are burning, but once the ketoret gets on, the heat is going to rise, more significantly. In terms of the smoke, we'll see a little bit about the question of the smoke in a bit. Hitchil meradeid v'yotzei. So he then begins to liradeid, and he goes out. So what's liradeid? We just had it back in here in Mishnah Bet. What did liradeid mean?
Leave to spread.
So I meant to like flatten out and then to like spread it and till today that you spread it out.
This is what was done with the coals. It's sort of spread out and flattened out.
Right. So Hitchil meradeid v'yotzei. He begins to. So the question is, what does meradeid mean here? And so we'll see in a moment the way the Bartanura says. But whatever is happening here is we have a question: who is doing this redud? What is the redud? Right? Because hitchil meradeid v'yotzei, and then he goes out. So who did whatever redud means? Who did the redud?
Assume it's not the person actually lighting the ketoret. So I'm going to assume that it's actually the assistant and not the person actually doing not the person zoche to do the ketoret.
Right. Presumably, it can't be. Why? It can't be the person who's doing the ketoret because.
Ketoret needs. Well, actually wouldn't need to be lit, would it? Because it's already on hot coals. It's already on embers.
No,
So
he has, but he hasn't put it on yet.
Hasn't he? Is he doing the redud over the coals, or is he doing it?
Well, here. So here. Okay. Let's go ahead.
I think what's happening is the assistant is flattening down the coals on the altar. The one who's actually bringing the koteret can't do it because his hands are full.
Okay. So let me put it. Let's put it a little bit differently. Let's ask this as a question. Hitchil meradeid v'yotzei. Who begins this redud and goes out? So, as Michael Werner said, it can't be the person who's doing the ketoret, because the ketoret hasn't yet been done. How do I know the ketoret hasn't yet been done? Because if you had any question, we'll read the next part. Lo haya maktir ad shehum hamimuneh omer lo hakter. The person who's going to be maktir the ketoret doesn't burn it until the mimuneh says to him, hakter, burn it. So presumably he hasn't done it yet because he's waiting for the Mimuneh to tell him to do, he's waiting for the Mimuneh to tell him Hakter. Im haya Kohen Gadol, if it was the Kohen Gadol who's doing the Ktoret, Hamumuneh Omer Ishi Kohen Gadol Hakter. Pashu Ha'am, the people leave, Vihiktir, and then he burns the Ktoret. Vihishtachavet V'yatsa, and he then bows down and he leaves. So clearly, at this point, Hitchil Meraded V'yotzei, this is not the Maktir Ktoret. Maktir Ktoret is going to be Maktir Ktoret here. And we also know that Pashu Ha'am, any other Kohanim who are inside have to leave. That's Migzerat HaKatuv. There can't be anybody else in the Heichal with him when he's burning the Ktoret. We'll see that in the Bartanura also. So this phrase here, Hitchil Meraded V'yotzei, presumably this is the person who had, according to the Bartanura, had taken the kaf from him. And now he's Meraded. Now the question is, what is he Meraded? Because he already said, we already said that there was another person there who was Zocher b'machta, and he was Meraded the coals themselves. He already spread the coals. Now we have this other person here, so what was he Meraded? So let's look at the Bartanura and see how he put some of these things together. So he says, Umulamdinoto, they teach him, Lefishalo Iktir Me'olam, since he never did the Ktoret ever, Keditnan La'el, Chadashim L'Ktoret Bo'u V'Hafisu. Like we learned in the Mishnah earlier, whoever is new to the Ktoret, come and do the Pais. Lefichach Hutzrichu L'Lamdo, therefore they needed to teach him. So what do they teach him? Havizahir Shemetatchil Ofenecha Shelo Tikaveh. Lest you begin before you that you don't get burns. Haya shofech haktarat al hagechalim letzad ma'arav rachok mimenu. He would pour the ktoret on the coals on the western side, far from him. So presumably he is on the right. He came in from the east, facing west. Here. Let's just bring that up for a second. Okay, we'll use this one. Okay, so let's just remind ourselves. So we described already how various people had come in now. So what among the people came in are the maktir, the person who was ochet to the machta, and then apparently another person, ohavo okrovo, and apparently also the mimuneh, the people who are teaching him. It could be that the mimuneh was teaching him, or even the person who's krovo or ohavo, maybe he's also teaching him. Maybe they've already done the Ktoret. The person who's with the Machta presumably is not the one teaching him. Why not? Why wouldn't it be the person that was Zocha to the Machta?
His hands are full, so to speak.
No. So even before he got in, why wouldn't he be one of the ones teaching him? How is he Zocha to the Machta?
He was actually standing next to the fellow with the Ktoret. So supposedly he also was participating in the pious, and supposedly he also was new.
I don't know if
to me.
supposedly is the right word, but let's say presumably.
Presumably, I meant presume.
Okay, right. So presumably the person with the machta also never did this before. This the Ohavo Krovo, we don't know exactly who he is, but he wasn't apparently part of the pais. And the Mumuneh, of course, is not part of the pais, right? Because the Mumuneh is conducting the pais. So they got in. So this is, you know, in these sketches, it's just so interesting to me the way they decide to do things, right? Because you know, like here, the outer mizbeach, they give you the overhead view, and with the shulchanot, they give you this kind of side view, and then here they give you like the full-on, you know, the full-on side view. This is the right. This is the shulchan. This is the menorah, and this, they have the steps here on the side. But of course, the steps would have gone up in front of the menorah, not on the side, right? Because it would need to be in front so you can reach all the different parts of the menorah. And then this is presumably the side view of the Mizbeach HaZahav. So he's standing, he walked in here. So based on the way the Bartanur explains it, it sounds like the Kohen HaMaktir, he's standing here. If we're looking overhead, so this would be like a square. He would be standing on the eastern side facing west, right? The Kodesh HaKodeshim here is in the west. He's facing west, and he's being told that he should start to put the Ktoret on the far side, on the other side, on the western side of the Mizbeach HaZahav. Yeah,
Just a quick question, sir. I mean, a quick comment on the perspective.
sure.
So until fairly recently, maps were, or at least Western map making, maps were in some sense narrative. So objects at different locations would be shown as they be experienced by somebody on the ground.
Yeah, I think it's a very
And it-
similar thing. It's a very, right, it's a similar kind of perspective. The pictures here, these were done in the 19th century, but like let's say the Tosus Yom Tov was earlier, maybe the 18th century, but you know, I think this would be, I mean, it would be interesting thing to study. I've looked at these pictures over many years, mostly when I'm doing Masechet Midot. I use these various pictures to try to get a better idea, but it's just fascinating to me. There's certain advantages in terms of the practicality. There's certain advantages for us to see the menorah here on the sun, you know, from the frontal view, and there's a certain advantage to see this mizbeach from the top view. Now we have, they include pictures, let's say, of the mizbeach nechoshet. They include side view pictures. I've shown some of them to you. They're printed in the back of the Mishnah here. Sometimes you need to see the side view to understand what's going on. Sometimes you need to see the top view to see what's going on. Seeing the top view of the menorah in this context is not necessarily that helpful, although I did show you, I believe, in one of the earlier shiurim, one of the Rambam sketches of the menorah where because he wanted to number each of the lamps so that you would know which are the 2 and which are the 5 and which is the Ner Ma'aravi. So he gave them all letters. He didn't give them, like they were Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, Zayin. So those you need to see kilu from the top. Here, in the context of understanding placement of the kelim in the hechal, it's maybe easier for us to recognize these things if we see them from the side. If I see them from the top, well, the Mizbeach would be recognizable. The Shulchan would also be recognizable, but less so. And the menorah would be the least recognizable. So there's a certain practical aspect to seeing them this way. And then it's just interesting, you contrast it, let's say, with the Shulchanot in the various places, that the Shulchanot are the only things that have some kind of perspective, right? They're drawn with perspective. Yeah, everything else is flat. Anyway, I just find it interesting.
There's also a kind of, at least in, once I'm more familiar with map making in Christian perspective, but there's also a theological theological ideas, aspects. Actually, aspects of it is a very good word. Aspect of a perspective, whereas you have sort of the and let me know if this is a distraction. I can talk about this some other time.
Well, if you want to just get, I'm kind of curious to give you a quick example. I would be curious. What are the theological
So a map, what we think of as a modern map is drawn from a physically impossible perspective. So it's drawn from the, you're trying to think about, it's drawn from the impossible point of view of somebody who's directly above each point simultaneously.
Right.
And there was a sense that in some sense this is a kind of God's eye perspective.
Okay.
I mean, I'm feeling very foggy right now, so I'm not sure how clearly I can get this over. But it's there's this idea that I mean, as at least a large scale map was meant to recapitulate sort of the monarch's what's called the vista de ojos, the monarch's sort of inspection of his realm, going from place to place. But as sort of the monarch increasingly is as the absolutist monarch increasingly is defined as God's representative on earth, he's sort of understood increasingly sort of in disembodied terms, and so the monarch's vista de ojos, the monarch's sort of inspection of the realm increasingly becomes close sort of to God's own perspective of the realm, directly over all points simultaneously and disembodied, so present everywhere at once.
Interesting. Very interesting.
I mean, I think that if we're talking about something like particularly divine space, that would become very vexed. Maybe, I don't know. Here I'm just speculating.
Okay, but anyway, it's. I mean, okay. I think that's all we'll say about that for now. But to me, it is interesting. And again, just to bring it back to our example here, it's interesting to think about what was going on in the mind of the person who made this illustration here. This illustration is done, as you see, Tzurat Beit HaMikdash al pi shitat Tosfot Yom Tov. So this is based on the Tosfos Yom Tov's understanding. I don't know that the Tosfos Yom Tov himself drew a picture that was later used in printing. I don't know. We do know, as I've showed you, that the Rambam did draw a bunch of pictures. So this tziyur of the Beit HaMikdash, Shayach Usof Perush Mishnayot Masachet Midot, this is actually a refined version of a picture that the Rambam put into his Perusha Mishnayot. It's all. I think I sent you, or I showed you in one of the shiurim some of these pictures. Okay, so I won't go over it again. So the Rambam's drawing was a bit cruder. This is just sort of a cleaned up version, and so meaning we know how the Rambam did it. I can tell you also that we know that the Rambam, who knew a lot, who knew a lot of advanced math and a lot of advanced geometry, but he drawing skills and this idea of drawing perspective was not yet a thing. People didn't do it yet. That wasn't until much later, I think, into the Renaissance, when people start to draw using perspective. So the Rambam is drawing it out in a way that he feels is practical for you to understand what's going on. So with that little side trip into map making, let's go back to the Mishnah. Let's go back to the Bartanura. So the Bartanura says, this is what they taught him. Shema tadchil lefanecha shelo tikaveh. So lest you begin in front of you that you don't get burnt. Hayashofechek toward al gachalim mitzad ma'arav rachok mimenu. He would pour it on the ketoret on the coals on the western side, far from him. Ucheshahaya mitpazer litzad atzmo hayat sobro. And if it's scattered to his side, toward him, he would gather it up, he would pile it up. Kedamrinin b'yoma, like it says in Yoma, Kedei shihei ashana shohet lavo, so that its smoke would take its time in coming. So there's this idea, the Gemara says in Yoma, that the Torah wasn't scattered out all at once, so that the smoke would take its time before coming up, right? It would give time for the smoke to start coming. And this is an honor. In other words, it's out of respect that one should take their time in doing the avodah. So the idea wasn't to take the ketoret, throw it on the mizbeach, and let it poof up all at once. It was supposed to be done in a kind of gradual way. V'hayat sover v'oseh hagal litzad ma'arav. So the way he was doing it, l'chatchila, is he would pile up the ketoret and make a mound of it on the western side. Shekeshabal ligror haktoret hasamuch lo utzovro litzad ma'arav rachok mimenu ve'eno nichveh. Right. So whatever ketoret happened to fall out close to him, he would drag that ketoret that's near him and let it pile up on the western side, far from him, so that he wouldn't get burnt by burning the ketoret between him and the western side, like not reaching over the mizbeach. And so he wouldn't get burnt from ketoret that has burnt. But if he started off by making the pile of ketoret in front of him, when he would then go to gather up the ketoret that had scattered beyond him, and bring it toward him, drag it back toward him, so then he would be burning his forearm when he's trying to gather up this ketoret that had now burnt in front of him. And this is what it is referring to in a Braita in Perakot Tziula, which is in Yoma. Sover Penima Shehu Chutzalo. He would gather up toward the inside, which is outside of him. So that's a tricky phrase. Penima, toward the inside, means toward the west. He would be tzover, right? The further in you go into the Heichal and then the Kodesh HaKodashim, that's Penima, that's inside. So he would gather up Penima. He would gather up from the part that was closer inside further inside the Beit HaMikdash. That was outside of him. In other words, it's farther away from him. And I think it's not, I was debating about doing that Gemara today. I think we'll look at that maybe a little bit later. I'll show you quickly, because it is a Gemara that is pertinent to us. It's in Masechet Yoma. So the Mishnah here, we haven't come to this Mishnah yet in Yoma, but we'll just look at, we'll take a quick look at this. Matnitina chitzona hayta prufa min hadarom upnimit min hatzafon mahalech beinehen ad shemagia letzafon higia letzafon ofech panav ledarom mahalech lismolo im parochet ad shemagia la'aron. Okay, so this is talking about the point in the avodah of Yom HaKippurim when the Kohen Gadol enters the Kodesh HaKodashim. And in Bayit Sheni, there were two parochot, right? In the Mishkan, we all know, as we just recently read in the Torah, there was a parochet. There was a single parochet that divided between the Kodesh and the Kodesh HaKodashim. In Mikdash of Shlomo, there was a wall that divided. And in Bayit Sheni, there were two parochot. So the outer parochet that was folded back from the south, upnimit, and the inner parochet was folded from the north. So here, let's go back and look for a second at the at this picture. So this is what it means. This is the south over here. Wait a second. That's the south, and I don't know why it's not drawing for me. Okay, but that's the north. So what it means is he's now going to enter the Kodesh HaKodashim. So the parochet here, this was folded. So the parochet, as each parochet is designed to be the width of the Hechal and the Kodesh HaKodashim, but on the south side, the outer one was folded back. He would enter here. He would face north and walk north. And then when he got north, so the northern side here is open. And then he would walk through here into the Kodesh HaKodashim. That's what's being described. Right, so he would walk between the two parochot. He would walk between them ad shemagia letzafon, until he got to the north. Higia letzafon, ofech panav v'darom. Once he got all the way to the north, he would turn his face southward. Mahalech lismolo. He would walk to his left. Im haparochet, alongside the parochet. Ad shehu magia la'aron. Right, so in the Mishkan, this mission is a little bit difficult. The Gemara talks about this because in the Mishkan there was only one parochet, so, right? And the only time you ever have these two parochot is in Bayit Sheni. But what was missing in Bayit Sheni, if you happen to know?
The Aaron and the Keruvim.
Right, the Aron wasn't there. So when it says, so here it seems like he's in Bayit Sheni. He got to the Aron. Well, he couldn't have gotten to the Aron. There was no Aron. So the Gemara explains it means he got to the place where the Aron had been, right? Would have been, which was the Even Shtia. So he got there. Aron, ben shnei abadim. So as I mentioned before, he's walking in, he's holding in his right hand the machta with the coals. He's holding in his left hand the kaf and the bazach. Higia la'aron, Notenet hamachta bein shnei habadim. When he got to the Aron, meaning the place of the Aron, he would take the coal pan and put it between the two rods that would be,
Stave.
say that what?
Staves. Steps.
Staves is all right. They're staves. I think okay, fine. It's another word. Ben shnei habadim, tzabaret haktoret al gabei gechalim. So he would gather the ktoret onto the coals. The nitmale kol habayit kulo ashan, and then the whole house, right? The building would become filled with smoke. Yatsa ubalo bederech beit knisato, right? And he would go out, and he would go out by the way that he came. Umitparel tefillah ktsara b'bayit hachitzon. He would pray a short prayer in the outer bayit, in other words, in the kodesh. V'lo yamarich b'tfilato, and he wouldn't go at length with his davening. Shelo lahavit et Yisrael, so as not to make the people of Israel worried or afraid. So a little bit further down, we'll skip the first part, which is where it talks about this question of there being no Aron. Here it's on Tzabar K'toret al Gabe Gechalim. He would gather the K'toret onto the coals. So the Gemara says, Tanan Kimanda Amar Tzobra. So this mission is being learned like the one who said that the K'toret would be gathered up, like piled up. Tanichada, so one source learned it. So bra penima shihi chutzalo. He would gather it up toward the inside, which is outside of him. The Tanya idach, and another person learned, so bra chutza, he would gather up outside of him, shihi penima lo, that is more toward the inside of him. So it's a little bit, the language is a bit confusing. We'll go over this in greater detail another time, but this is the part that the Bartzner was referring to. Marabai Tanaihi. So Bai says that this is in fact a machloket Tanaim. Marabai, and Abaye says, Mistabra Kamandamar Penima Shihi Chutzalo. It makes sense to say that when he did this, he did it toward the inside, in other words, further toward the west, that would be outside of him, further away from him. Why does that make sense? Did none, because, and he quotes our Mishnah that we're learning now. Because we learned in the Mishnah, in Tamid, Melamdimoto, we teach him, Nizaher, Shelo Tatchil Mipanecha, Shema Tichveh. That you should not begin before you, lest you get burnt. Rashi here explains, Shelo Tatchil Mipanecha, Litzbor v'leilei chala. You shouldn't start to gather the Torah up, pile the Torah up in front of you, and then to leilei chala, right, to bring it further away from you afterwards. Shema tichveh, lest you get burnt. Shektoret shetzabarta, because the Torah that you have gathered up, litzidcha, on your side, bo'eret tamid, it's always burning. And then your forearm that is being stretched out, right, to go and now push the pile of the Torah to start to spread it out on the coals, that's going to go past the initial pile, and it's going to get burnt, b'timur, with the rising of the smoke that's coming up. So this is the Gemara that the Bartanura is referencing. One of the reasons I wanted to point it out is it's interesting, right? Because the context, and this is why I took a moment to do a little bit of the context. The context there is not really the same context as we have, because there it's the Kohen Gadol in the Kodesh HaKodashim. It's not exactly the same thing as what's happening now, but the Bartun is saying the principle is the same. It's the same idea that when the Kohen, whether it was the Kohen doing the Ktoret on Yom Kippurim, or whether it was the Kohen Gadol doing Ktoret on Yom Kippurim, or whether it was a regular Kohen doing the everyday Ktoret, this would be a practical thing for them to know how to do, right? That they start by putting the pile far from them, and then they can bring it back. And even if there's some that's scattered, they can push that onto the bigger pile before they start to really burn all of it. So now we get up to this phrase, Hitchil Meraded V'yotzei. So he starts to be Meraded, and then he goes out. So Hitchil Meraded V'yotzei, Bartanur says, Kolmar, Miyad Shirided Haktoret Al Gabe Gechalim Yatsa. So Meraded here, he understands to be passive. It's not it's a little bit of a difficulty in the language, because it would be like Hitchil Lihiraded, I think would be the proper formation. The Bartanur understands it means, that is to say, as soon as the Ktoret has flattened out on top of the coals, Yatsa, then he would go out. So who would be going out? So it could be that the way the Bartanur understands it is that, in fact, it is talking about the person who's doing the Ktoret, because as we see, nobody's allowed to be in there with him when he's burning the Ktoret. But there are other perushim to this, which I'll bring for you in a moment. Let's finish the Bartanura. Parshu ha'am. Right, so right. So according to this is what it sounds like. Hitchil Meraded V'yotzei. That the way the Bartanura reads the Mishnah is saying the Hitchil Meraded means the Ktoret starts to get flattened out, and then the person who is burning the Ktoret would go out. And then the rest of the Mishnah is commenting in a kind of general fashion. Lo haya maktir baktir ad shemumune omer lo hakter. So it's a little bit out of order, right? Because it doesn't say, here it says melamdimoto, they were actively teaching him how to do this. And then, according to the way the Bartanur was reading, he did it, but it would seem to make more sense that in between here and here, the Mumuneh should have said to him Hakter. But we're only learning that now. The Maktir would not have burnt the Ktoret until the Mumuneh said to him Hakter. And if he was the Kohen Gadol, he would have said Ishi Kohen Gadol Hakter. And then Parshu Ha'am, this would come after the Mumuneh had told him to burn. The people would leave. So who are the people who would leave? Kol haKohanim poshim mibein ha'ulam v'lamizbeach b'shat haktarat ktoret. So where are they leaving from? Not necessarily even from in the Heichal. They were leaving from the area between the ulam and the mizbeach. So just to remind us about that area. Actually, I like the other picture for this better. Just a second. Right. So in this picture, this is the Mizbeach HaKtoret. This whole area here is the Heichal. This whole area here is the Ulam. This, of course, is the Mizbeach. And all of the Kohanim who would have been between the Ulam and the Mizbeach in this area here, anywhere in this area here. Once the Mumuneh said to the Maktir, he would say Hakter, all of the Kohanim would clear out of this whole area. The Bartanur will explain why. Kol Kohanim poshim mibein ha'ulam v'lamizbech b'sha'at haktarat haktoreh. Why? Dichtiv v'chol adam lo yeh ba'ol moed b'va'ol lechaper b'kodesh. So you may remember this pasuk. I mean, you might remember it bichlal, right? But we learned it back in the beginning of our Yoma studies. This is in Achrei Mot. So this is talking about burning the Ktoret. This is talking about the Avodah on Yom Kippurim. And it says, just to go back one or two psukim, the Shachat Tzira Chatata Shera'am, the Kohen Gadol shechted the seer for the Chatat. He would bring the blood El Mibeit La Parochet, in other words, into the Kodesh HaKodashim, and he would do its blood the way he did with the blood of the bullock, and he would sprinkle it on the kaparet in front of the kaparet, v'chiper al kodesh mitumot b'nei Yisrael, and he would atone for on the kodesh or in the kodesh mitumot b'nei Yisrael, u'mipishehem. And then it says pasuk Yudzayin v'chol adam lo yeh ba'ol hamoed b'vo'ol lechaper b'kodesh ad seito. No person can be with him, with the Kohen Gadol in the Ohel Moed, when he comes in to atone in the Kodesh, until he leaves. V'chiper ba'ado v'ad beito v'ad kol kahal Yisrael. So this is talking about, this pasuk tells me that when the Kohen Gadol is doing the Avodah Lifnei V'Lifnim on Yom Kippurim, no one can be anywhere in that whole area. So what do we learn out from this Li'inyanenu? So the Bartanura says that here also, on a daily basis, when the Kohen, who was a Kohen Yehadiot in most cases, it could have been the Kohen Gadol, because he's allowed to do any Avodah he wants. But let's say this is not the Kohen Gadol, it's just a regular Kohen. He's doing the Ketores as we described. All of these people had to leave not only the Heichal and not only the Ulam, but even the area between the Ulam and the Mizbech. They had to go all the way back from that area of the Beit HaMikdash. So, why? Because Kol Adam lo yeh ba'ol moed b'vo'ol lechaper b'kodesh, Kol kapara shena'aseit b'kodesh, Kol Adam lo yeh ba'ol moed. So this is the drasha. Any atonement that is being done in the Kodesh, no person can be in the Ohel Moed. Hilkach, bein b'shat haktara, bein b'shat matan damim shel par kohen Mashiach, ufar ha'alem davar shel tzibur, usirei avodah zara, hayu kohanim poshim mibein ha'ulam v'lamizbeach. Therefore, not only for now, when the Kohen is doing the Ketores, whether it's the time that a Kohen is doing the Ketores, or whether it's a time when the blood is being given from the Par Kohen Mashiach, who Par Ha'alem Davar Shel Tzibur, right? So these are special chataot where the blood has to be sprinkled on the Mizbech inside when the Kohen Mashiach, right, the Kohen sinned and he had to bring a special korban. or Halem Davar Shel Tzibur, when the Beit Din was mored to the people to do something that they shouldn't, that they made a mistake about, and then they realized, and they have to bring a korban for that. These are special korbanot chata. Sirei avodah zarah, the seir that was done for somebody who violated avodah zarah. Hayu kohanim. So all of those things, the kapara is being done inside, right? Mostly kapara is achieved by sprinkling blood of whatever korban on the mizbeach hanachoshet outside. But there were certain korbanot that had to have their blood sprinkled inside, and the ktoret, which is always done inside, which is also a kapara. So they're learning out from this pasuk about the avodah that was done in the Beit in the inside of the Kodesh and the Kodesh HaKodeshim on Yom Kippur, that anytime kapara is done inside, no one can be there except the particular kohen who was carrying out that avodah. Aval b'shat haktarat ktoret shel Yoma Kippurim, but at the time when the Ktoret of Yom Kippur is being burnt, lo hayu poshim ela min ha'echal bilvad. When the Kohen Gadol was doing the Ktoret that we were just taking a look at a moment ago, inside the Kodesh HaKodeshim on Yom Kippur, they only had to leave the Heichal, and they didn't have to leave from the Heichal and beyond, like from the Heichal and beyond. They didn't have to leave the Ulam ubein ha'olam v'mizbeach. Why? The Fishik Toret Shel Yom HaKippurim Lo Haya B'chutz Behechal, because that Toret was not outside in the Heichal. In other words, outside of the Kodesh HaKodeshim in the Heichal. Al Mizbach HaZahav. It was not brought on the golden altar. El Lifnai V'Lifnim B'Beit Kodesh HaKodeshim. So in other words, it was further inside, so it was sufficient for them to put one level in between them and the Kodesh HaKodeshim, which meant they had to clear out of the Heichal, but they didn't have to go further than that. But when the kapara is being done in the Heichal, then they have to leave the next area. The next area is Bein Ha'ulam Lemizbech, as I will show you in a moment. Therefore, they didn't have to leave from between the Ulam and the Mizbech, rather just from the Heichal alone. Just a second. Yeah. So I'll just show you this idea of each of these areas having a particular significance. We see this in the Mishnah in Kelim, which I'm now showing you. I don't know if you've ever learned Kelim. Maybe, did either of you, Michael Schwartz, did you learn Kelim?
Yeah, I've gone through it. Yes, whether I remember is another story.
Yeah, no, it's a very difficult. Taharot is very difficult. This relative, I don't. Michael Werner, did you ever learn Kelim? Uh-oh. Michael Werner, are you still with us?
I'm still here.
Oh, did you ever learn Kelim?
Learn Kalim. I don't recall.
Okay, it's okay. The beginning, the first chapter.
I'm actually dimming out right now. So.
Yeah, no, I understand this. I don't want to press you, and we're going to finish in a moment. The first chapter of Kelim starts talking about the various kinds of tuma and levels of tuma, and then along these lines, we come to these Mishnayot, beginning with Mishnah Vav. I'm going to read through them just to put this idea in context. That we have this idea that the holiest place is the Kodesh HaKodeshim, and then after that would be the Heichal, and then after that would be Bein Ulam LaMizbeach. So it's a little more detailed than that, but let's just look and see how it says it in the Mishnah. Eser Kedushotain. There's 10 holinesses. Eretz Yisrael mekudeshet mikol haaretzot. So the land of Israel is holier than any other land, than all other lands. Mahi kedushata. What is its kedusha? Shemivim mimena haomer babikurim mishtei halechem. Mashein mivim kein mikol haaretzot. Right, because we bring these particular types of korbanot, which ultimately go to the Beit Hamikdash. The Omer, the first fruits, the Shtei Halechem, which is from the Sa'orah that's brought around, for Shavuot, we bring Shtei Halechem. And those are, you can only bring those from Eretz Yisrael. So that establishes a certain level of Kedusha in Eretz Yisrael. Ayarot mukafot chama mekudashot mimena. So cities that are surrounded by a wall are holier than that. In other words, they're holier than Stam Eretz Yisrael. And what's their holiness? Shemashachim tochan hametzoraim, u'mesabvim letochan meit ad sheyirtzu, yatzai ein machzirin ota. So what are the levels of holiness in a walled city? That Metzorah has to be sent out of a walled city, any walled city, not just Jerusalem, and if you have a dead body, it can be taken around the city until they want to bury it. But Yatzah, once it leaves the walled city, you can't bring it back in. Inside of the wall is greater than them. Inside of the wall of Yerushalayim. Sholchim sham kodashim kalim u'maaser sheni. You can eat korbanot that are kodashim kalim inside of the walls of Jerusalem, and you can also eat maaser sheni inside of Jerusalem. Har
Question.
Sure.
Just to backtrack. So when they're talking about the walled cities, are they talking about Stam walled cities, or they talk about cities that were walled in the time of Yehoshua? As we learned, as comes up in the with Shushan Purim.
Very good. So, as a matter of fact, it is Miyamot Yoshua bin Nun, right? The Bartanur says, "I wrote Mekopot Chama Miyamot Yoshua bin Nun," and then he learns it out. There's a limud for that. But yes, it's a good question, and that's the answer. Would have been cities that had been walled from the time of Yoshua bin Nun have this status of a walled city for these purposes that it just mentioned. And now we find out that the walled city of Jerusalem has an even higher status than other walled cities, because you can eat kachim kalim and you can eat meiser sheni inside. And then Har Habayit, right, the whole area of Har Habayit is more kadosh than the inner walled, the walled city of Jerusalem. Why is it more? How is it more kadosh? Shein zavim v'zavot nidot v'yildot nichnasim l'sham. People who are tamei ziva, whether men who are zavim or women who are zavot, or women who are nidot, or women who had given birth, they're not allowed to go on to Har Habayit. Hachel mikudash mimenu. The chel is the area on Har Habayit that's surrounded also by a wall. And that's even more kadosh. Shein goyim u'tamei meit nichnasim l'sham. Non-Jews and anybody who's tamei meit cannot go there. Ezrat nashim mikudeshet mimenu. The Ezrat nashim is more kadosh than the area of the chel. Just a second. No, hold on. Well, okay, I see. This is not really a proportional picture, but this picture here is a picture of the outer wall. Here is the wall of the chel. This area, or all around, that's the chel. In reality, this part here was bigger. This, like I said, this is not proportional, but it doesn't matter. For our purposes, this is the chel, and then coming in from the east, this is the Ezrat Nashim that it's talking about. So what's about the Ezrat Nashim? Ezrat Nashim is the Ezrat Nashim is more kadosh than the chel. Shein tvul yom nichnas sham, vein chayavim alei chatat. The tvul yom, we discussed what tvul yom is many times, is not allowed to go into the Ezrat Nashim, but ein chayavim alei chatat. If somebody is tamei who goes into the Ezrat Nashim, b'shogeg, when they're tamei, they're not chayav b'chatat, right? As we'll see, but if they go in further, they would be chayav b'chatat. Ezrat Yisrael mikudeshet mimenu, shein mechusar kippurim nichnas sham v'chayavim alei chatat. So let's make this a little bigger. This is the Ezrat Yisrael. So in the next stage up, it's literally up, right? Because here these are the ma'alot of the shir of the shirei hama'alot. These are the steps going into from the Ezrat Nashim to go into the Ezrat Yisrael. So going into the Ezrat Yisrael is more kadosh because somebody's mechusar kippurim, meaning somebody who had, for example, a yoledet who gave birth, who has to still bring her. She went to the mikvah, let's say at the end of the day, but she still has to bring her korban in the morning in order to get her kapara. So kol zman that she didn't, that like her or a zav or mitzorah, any people who still need to bring a korban as a final stage of their process, they're mechusrei kippurim, and if they walk in there, so even though they're not tamei for every purpose, but they are tamei enough that they're not allowed to go into the Ezrat Yisrael. V'chayivim lechatat. Ezrat HaKohanim mekudeshet mimena. The Ezrat Kohanim is even more kadosh. Shein Yisrael nichnasim l'sham. Anybody who's not a Kohen, right? Yisrael is not allowed to go into Ezrat Kohanim, ela bishat tzarchehem, except for the time when they have their needs there, l'smicha, l'shchita, v'litnufa, right? If they have to do smicha or slaughter an animal or for the waving of the parts of the animal. And as we know, Yisrael is allowed to shecht a korban. So if he's going there to shecht his own korban, he's allowed for that purpose to go into the Ezrat Kohanim, right? So this is the Ezrat Kohanim. Basically, the whole rest of this area, excuse me, except as we'll see, what's the next stage? Bein ha'ulam v'lamizbech mikudash mimena. So this area that we've been talking about between the ulam and the mizbech is even more kadosh than the rest of Ezrat Kohanim. Shein ba'alei mumin ufurei rosh nichnasim l'sham. Kohanim, even Kohanim who aren't allowed to go there if they're a Baal Mum or if they're Fruei Rosh, meaning if they're in mourning or they're Onanim, they're not allowed to go there. And then Ha'echal Mekudash Mimenu, the Ha'echal is even more kadosh than Bein Ulam Lamizbeach. She'nichnas Hashem Ela Rechutz Yadayim V'Raglayim. You're not allowed to go in there unless you've a Kohen can't go there unless he washed his hands and his legs. Kodesh HaKodeshim Mekudash Mehem She'nichnas Hashem El Kohen Gadol B'Yom HaKippurim B'Shat HaAvodah. Right, as we all know, right? The only person who ever goes into the Kodesh HaKodeshim is the Kohen Gadol in Yom Kippurim, and only to go and do the Avodah. I'll just finish off this last part because it will bring it back to our Mishnah. Amar Rabbi Yossi disagrees in part. he says, "B'chamisha dvarim ben ha'olam v'lemizbeach shaveh lahechal." He says there are 5 things about which this area of between the ulam and the mizbeach is the same as the hechal. So he says that she'ein bali mumim ufrei rosh shtei yayin v'shelo ruchut yadayim raglayim nichnasim l'sham. None of those people can go in either of those areas. Uforshin mibein ha'olam v'lamizbeach b'shat ha'ktara. This comes back to our Mishnah. And Kohanim have to leave the area between the Ulam and the Mizbeach at the time of the Haktara of the Ktoret. Okay, so just to sign off for today. So what do we see? This was the way. So this was the Ktoret. The Ktoret was done by this fellow who's going to be doing it for the first and only time in his life. And at the point that he's doing, that he's actually going to be burning the Ktoret, before he does that, everyone has to leave, not just the Hechal. You have to clear out of the Hechal, and then the next level, right? The next level of Kedusha, which is between the Ulam and the Mizbeach. They all have to clear out. So you can understand there's a kind of a parallel on a daily basis with the bringing of the Ktoret to what the Kohen Gadol does on Yom Kippurim. So on the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippurim brings the Ktoret in the Kodesh HaKodeshim. So the Kohanim cannot be in the Heichal, but they can be between the Mizbeach and the Ulam. And then you bring it back a notch on a daily basis. The Kohen is doing the Ktoret in the Heichal. Everybody has to clear out of the next level, which is Bein Ulam LaMizbeach. And I think that's it for tonight. Any questions or comments? Okay, that's fine. So I hope this is okay. It's a lot to take in, and I didn't, sometimes it's, I'm a little bit scattered, but I think it's okay. And next week, I haven't decided. Either we're gonna go straight and like we're now gonna be on the last chapter of Tamid, or I may do some of the things that we touched on. I have a feeling what we'll do is we're gonna go ahead and finish off Tamid, and then I'm gonna go back over certain particular things that I said we'll go back on, like the Beit HaMoked and about the menorah, and maybe some other things about the Ktoret. And that should give us, I think, a reasonable grounding to ultimately go back to Yoma and continue in Yoma. Now we'll be able to put Yoma in a greater context.
Would there be any interest in doing anything related to Pesach, since we'll be in Nisan?
Well, I think in my head I was thinking to do something maybe just before Pesach. There is I had something in mind that would also tie it in a little bit to what we're doing here. So I think next week we're going to continue with Tamid, but before Pesach, I will do at least one thing that ties in some of these things that we're learning now with Pesach. Okay?
Okay.
Okay, but I'm glad you mentioned it. All right, everybody, I think we're all really tired. Let's all get some good rest. I know that I'm knocked out. I've had terrible sleep the last few days, so I hope all of you are doing better than me. Have a good evening.
All right. Thanks. Good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.